17 skulls don't stack themselves. When hikers stumbled upon the forgotten campsite in the summer of 2020, nestled deep in a forgotten hollow of the Appalachian Range, they expected abandoned gear, maybe some rusted traps. What they found instead was a tableau frozen in time, a question mark carved into 80 years of silence. Our story begins in the bitter cold of January 1940, when 5 experienced trappers signed a winter contract that would take them into the most remote corners of the Cumberland Gap region. The pine needles crunched underfoot like broken glass. The air carried that sharp, metallic scent of approaching snow. Canvas tents sagged under frost so thick it felt like stone when you touched it. The team leader was a man named Virgil Cates, 42 years old, a seasoned woodsman who'd spent nearly 2 decades working trap lines across 3 states. His crew consisted of his younger brother Eugene, 28, along with 3 other men from their hometown of Harlan, Kentucky, Marcus Webb, Daniel Pruitt, and a quiet fellow named Amos Finch, who kept mostly to himself, but could read animal tracks better than anyone in the county. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. If you're listening to this alone in the dark, you're braver than most. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this story only gets stranger from here. The contract itself was straightforward, at least on paper. A timber company operating out of Virginia needed trappers to clear predators, mainly wolves and wildcats, from a tract of old-growth forest they planned to log come spring. The pay was exceptional for the time, $200 per man, roughly equivalent to 4 months' wages for most workers in Appalachia. But the location gave even experienced trappers pause. The assigned territory sat in a region locals called the Sink, a depression in the mountain range where fog pooled like standing water and compasses were known to spin lazily in circles. Old-timers claimed the Cherokee had avoided the area long before white settlers arrived, though nobody could agree on why. Some said bad spirits. Others muttered about sinkholes that opened without warning, swallowing entire trees overnight. Virgil Cates didn't put much stock in superstition. He'd survived blizzards, bear attacks, and one memorable encounter with moonshiners who didn't appreciate him stumbling onto their operation. Mountains were dangerous, sure, but they followed rules. Respect the weather, watch your footing, keep your rifle clean and your food stored high. Do those things and you'd walk out the same way you walked in. The team departed Harlan on January 8, 1940, a Tuesday morning so cold the truck's engine nearly refused to turn over. Virgil's wife Mary stood in the doorway of their small house, arms crossed against the chill, watching the men load their gear. She'd later tell investigators that her husband seemed distracted that morning, kept checking and rechecking his pack like he'd forgotten something important. "How long this time?" she'd asked. "6 weeks, maybe 8, Virgil had replied. "We'll be back before the thaw." 3 weeks into the contract, on January 27th, a supply runner named Owen McAllister made his scheduled visit to the camp. He found the men in good spirits despite the brutal cold. They'd already collected nearly 40 pelts and had seen signs of a large wolf pack moving through the area. Virgil mentioned they'd need to push deeper into the Sink to complete the job, but he seemed confident about making their deadline. Owen left them on January 28th with fresh supplies and a promise to return in 2 weeks. He never saw any of them alive again. When Owen returned on February 11th, the camp was empty. Not abandoned, empty. Tents still stood. The supply cache remained fully stocked. Tools lay scattered around the fire pit, as if the men had simply stood up mid-task and walked away. But there were no tracks leading out of camp. No signs of struggle, and most puzzling of all, no indication that anyone had packed to leave. Owen McAllister rode back to Harlan faster than he'd ever ridden before, his horse's breath coming in great white plumes. By February 13th, a search party of 20 men had assembled. They combed the area for 5 days, fighting through a late-season snowstorm that dumped nearly 2 feet of fresh powder and erased what few clues might have existed. On February 18th, a massive landslide swept through the sink. Rescue efforts were called off. The general consensus held that the trappers had been caught in a secondary slide days earlier, their bodies buried under tons of rock and frozen earth. Case closed. Tragedy, but not unprecedented in that unforgiving terrain. Mary Cates never accepted that explanation. For decades, she wrote letters to state officials, to the timber company, to anyone who might listen. She died in 1986, still waiting for answers. The truth waited in the mountains. What those hikers found 80 years later would make the landslide theory seem almost comforting by comparison. The smell hit them first. Not decay, but something older, like opening a tomb sealed before memory began. Sarah Chen and Marcus Holloway weren't looking for history when they veered off the Appalachian Trail that June morning in 2020. They were experienced backpackers chasing a rumor about an unnamed waterfall supposedly hidden 3 miles east of their planned route through the Daniel Boone National Forest. The forest floor there felt wrong underfoot. Moss grew in strange circular patterns. Tree bark showed deep vertical scarring that neither hiker could identify. And the silence, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small, wet sounds of your tongue against your teeth. Later told investigators he almost turned back twice. Some instinct, some primal warning system left over from when humans were prey animals, kept whispering that they'd wandered into territory that didn't want them. They found the first cabin at approximately 2:15 p.m., tucked into a natural depression where the mountainside folded in on itself. The structure stood intact, despite 8 decades of weather, its log walls silvered with age but fundamentally sound. The roof hadn't collapsed. The door hung slightly ajar, frozen on rusted hinges that screamed when Sarah pushed it open. Inside, time had stopped. A tin coffee pot sat on an iron stove, the coffee inside reduced to black crystalline residue. 3 tin cups waited on a rough-hewn table, arranged as if someone had just finished pouring. Wool blankets lay folded on crude bunk frames. A pair of work gloves rested on a windowsill, fingers curled as though still shaped by the hands that had worn them. But it was the tools that made Sarah's breath catch. Trapping equipment covered every surface: leg-hold traps, snares, skinning knives with bone handles, stretching frames built from saplings. Everything showed signs of regular use and careful maintenance. These weren't abandoned supplies. They were interrupted supplies, left mid-season by people who expected to return. Marcus had already moved to the second cabin 30 yards south. His shout brought Sarah running. "You need to see this," he called, his voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "Right now." The second structure was larger, clearly a communal workspace. Pelts hung from ceiling beams, fox, bobcat, what looked like wolf, still mostly intact despite the decades, preserved by the dry mountain air and sub-zero winters. A workbench held a partially cleaned hide, the scraping tools laid out in neat progression. And against the far wall, stacked with unsettling precision beside a stone fire pit, sat 17 human skulls. They weren't scattered. They weren't hidden. They were arranged in a pyramid formation, 3 across the base, then 2, then one at the apex. Each skull faced the same direction, toward the cabin door. Each showed the same uniform weathering, and each bore identical markings. 3 parallel grooves carved into the crown, running front to back. Deliberate, ritualistic, impossible to misinterpret as anything accidental. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. No signal, of course. They were miles from the nearest cell tower. But the camera worked. She documented everything, her finger stabbing the shutter button again and again, capturing angles, capturing context, capturing proof that this nightmare was real. They didn't touch anything. They barely breathed. Some unspoken agreement passed between them. Get out. Get help. Let professionals handle whatever darkness they'd stumbled into. The hike back to the main trail took 90 minutes. Sarah threw up twice. Marcus kept checking behind them, convinced they were being followed, though the forest remained empty and still. By 7 p.m., they'd reached their vehicle. By 8:30, they sat in the Whitley County Sheriff's Office, watching Deputy Frank Morrison's expression shift from polite skepticism to genuine alarm as he scrolled through Sarah's photographs. "You're absolutely certain about the location?" Morrison asked. "We dropped a GPS pin," Marcus replied. "Coordinates are in the file." Morrison made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The third went to the FBI field office in Louisville. Within 48 hours, a joint task force descended on the site. Forensic anthropologists, federal agents, park rangers, and a cadre of investigators who'd spent careers examining crime scenes, but had never encountered anything quite like this. What they found in those cabins would take months to fully catalog and years to partially understand. But the skulls posed the first and most disturbing question. If 5 trappers entered the mountains, why were there 17 skulls arranged by their fire? Where did the other 12 come from? Numbers don't lie, but sometimes they refuse to make sense. Dr. Elizabeth Nakamura, chief forensic anthropologist for the FBI's evidence response team, had examined over 300 skeletal remains in her 20-year career. She'd identified victims from decades-old cold cases, sorted commingled remains from mass disasters, and reconstructed trauma patterns from fragments other experts deemed hopeless. But when she knelt beside that pyramid of skulls in the summer of 2020, her training collided with something that shouldn't exist. The first skull she examined, catalog number AS01 for Appalachian Site 01, showed clear indicators of mid-20th century dental work. Amalgam fillings in the molars, consistent with 1930s and 40s American dentistry. Age at death, approximately 35 to 40 years old. Male, cause of death, blunt force trauma to the left parietal bone. The impact pattern suggesting a fall or strike from a heavy object. Standard forensic conclusions. Nothing remarkable. Then she moved to skull AS03. The bone density was wrong. The suture closure patterns indicated an age at death of roughly 40 years old, but the isotope analysis, a technique that measures trace elements absorbed during life, suggested the individual had died sometime between 1840 and 1860, nearly a century before the trappers vanished. Dr. Nakamura ran the test 3 times. The results didn't change. Of the 17 skulls, 5 matched the expected time frame for the 1940 disappearance. The remaining 12 spanned a range that made no logical sense. 2 from the 1840s, 3 from the 1870s, 1 from approximately 1910, 4 from the 1920s, and 3 that defied precise dating due to unusual preservation characteristics. "It's like someone collected them," Dr. Nakamura told the investigative team, during a briefing on July 15, 2020. But that raises the question, collected them from where? And why bring them all to the same place? The cabins themselves offered more questions than answers. Dendrochronology, the study of tree ring patterns in the log walls, confirmed construction in late 1939 or early 1940, consistent with the trapper team's contract timeline. But carbon dating of wood ash from the fire pit showed signs of use spanning decades, with the most recent fire occurring sometime in the late 1930s or early 40s. Someone had used that camp repeatedly over an extended period. Inside the main workspace cabin, investigators found a leather-bound journal wedged between floorboards. The entries, written in faded pencil, belonged to Virgil Cates. Most documented routine trapping activities, weather observations, trap locations, pelt counts, but the final entries, dated late January 1940, showed a marked shift in tone. January 23rd, found tracks near the North Ridge. Not wolf, not bear, something walking on two legs, but the stride is wrong. Eugene thinks I'm seeing things. Maybe I am. January 25th. Marcus won't go near the eastern quadrant anymore. Says he heard singing last night, coming from deeper in the sink. I heard it too. Old songs in a language I almost recognize but can't quite place. Amos says the Cherokee have stories about this place. Says we should leave. The contract isn't worth it. January 27th. Supply runner came today. Didn't mention the voices. Didn't mention what Daniel found in the cave. If we tell, they'll think we've gone mad. 6 more days and we're done here. 6 more days. The journal ended there. No explanation of what Daniel Pruitt had found. No description of the cave's location. Just silence, preserved in the white space of empty pages. The cave proved difficult to locate. Search teams combed a 2-mile radius around the camp, checking every depression, every shadow that might conceal an entrance. It was a tracking dog named Sadie who finally alerted to a collapsed opening 70 yards upslope from the cabins, nearly invisible beneath 8 decades of leaf litter and erosion. Spelunkers cleared the entrance on July 28th. The cave system extended roughly 200 feet into the mountainside, a limestone tube carved by ancient water flow. The temperature inside held steady at 48 degrees, cold enough to preserve organic material, but not cold enough to freeze it solid. They found the bones within the first 50 feet, not arranged, not ritualized, just scattered across the cave floor like discarded toys. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all jumbled together in a chaotic pile. Preliminary counts suggested remains from at least 11 individuals, possibly more. The bones showed signs of carnivore gnawing, but the damage patterns were inconsistent with known predators in the region. And carved into the cave wall, approximately 6 feet above the bone pile, someone had etched a crude map. Lines representing ridges and valleys, symbols marking specific locations, and at 17 different points, small circles, each one carefully numbered from 1 to 17. A collection record. Dr. Nakamura stood in that cave for 40 minutes, her headlamp beam playing across the etchings, her mind racing through scenarios and rejecting each one. Serial killers kept trophies, yes, but serial killers operating in rural Appalachia across a century of time. Serial killers who somehow remained unknown, undetected, leaving no pattern recognizable enough to link the deaths? Or something else entirely? Something that wore the shape of human behavior but originated from a different motivation altogether. What would you do? She later asked her team. If you realized the victims weren't the ones who disappeared in 1940? What if the trappers were the last collectors? not the prey. The question hung in the air like smoke. Because if Virgil Cates and his crew had been continuing something rather than stumbling into it, then the real horror wasn't what happened to them. It was what they'd been doing before they vanished. 3 words carved into wood. They came willing. Agent David Torres, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, arrived at the site on August 3, 2020, carrying file boxes containing a century's worth of missing persons reports from a 6-county region of eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. His specialty was historical pattern analysis, finding connections between cold cases that time and jurisdictional boundaries had allowed to slip through the cracks. What he found in those mountains rewrote his understanding of predation. The first connection emerged from a report filed in October 1846. A trapper named Silas Hardwick, working alone in the Cumberland Gap, failed to return from his autumn run. His wife reported him missing after 2 months of silence. Local authorities searched for 3 days, found nothing, and closed the case with the assumption he'd fallen victim to one of a dozen hazards that claimed solitary woodsman: injury, exposure, animal attack, or simple misfortune. Standard frontier tragedy. Unremarkable, except Silas Hardwick's dental records, preserved in a Richmond archive by his dentist who'd been studying tooth decay patterns, matched skull AS06 with 93% certainty. Torres worked backward from that identification, cross-referencing disappearances with the estimated death dates from Dr. Nakamura's analysis. A pattern crystallized like frost on glass. Every 20 to 30 years, someone vanished in or near the sink. 1846, Silas Hardwick. 1873, 2 brothers, Thomas and William Gentry, prospecting for coal. 1878, a surveyor named Robert Kincaid, mapping routes for potential railroad expansion. 1912, Albert Morrison, a timber cruiser evaluating old-growth stands. 1921, 3 hunters from Harlan, James Cooper, Samuel Oates, and a man identified only as Dutch in newspaper accounts. 1928, 2 revenuers, federal agents tracking moonshine operations through the backcountry. And then, 1940, Virgil Cates and his crew. The intervals weren't precise, but they clustered within a recognizable range. Someone, or something, had been operating in that territory for at least a century, selecting victims with chilling consistency. All male, all experienced outdoorsmen, all working alone or in small groups, all vanishing without trace until their remains ended up in a pyramid beside a fire pit. But Torres noticed something else, something that turned his blood cold during a 3 a.m. review session in his hotel room. The victims weren't random. Each disappearance occurred during periods of heightened activity in the region. Silas Hardwick vanished during a boom in fur trading. The Gentry brothers disappeared while coal prospecting fever swept through Appalachia. The 1921 hunters went missing during Prohibition, when every hollow hosted stills and strangers asking questions got buried in unmarked graves. The pattern suggested opportunity rather than compulsion. Someone waited for moments when missing persons wouldn't draw unusual attention, when disappearances could be attributed to the dangerous nature of the work itself. Calculated, patient, disturbingly intelligent. "We're not looking at impulse," Torres explained to the task force during an August 7th briefing. "We're looking at something that understands human behavior well enough to exploit our assumptions." Every one of these men vanished during circumstances that provided built-in explanations. Natural causes, occupational hazards. We stopped looking because the answers seemed obvious. The cave map supported this theory. When Torres overlaid the 17 marked locations onto modern topographical surveys, Each point corresponded to a known disappearance site, places where search parties had looked and found nothing, then moved on. A hunting ground, mapped with the precision of someone who'd studied it for generations. But one detail refused to fit the serial predator model. In the main cabin, investigators found a locked metal box buried beneath the floorboards. The lock had rusted through. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, lay 17 sets of personal effects. Pocket watches, wedding rings, photographs, letters from home, a harmonica, a small Bible with a name inscribed on the flyleaf. Trophies, Torres thought initially. Keepsakes taken from victims. Then Dr. Nakamura pointed out something he'd missed. Each item showed signs of careful preservation, treated with oils and wrapped with obvious care to prevent decay. And more troubling still, several items included notes written in different hands. One note, tucked inside a pocket watch belonging to Thomas Gentry, read, "For Margaret and the children, tell them I went peaceful." Another, wrapped around a wedding band, stated simply, "I'm sorry, I had to see." The handwriting matched signatures from historical documents linked to the victims themselves. These weren't trophies taken by a killer. These were final messages left by the dying, preserved by someone who wanted them found. Torres spent 3 days wrestling with this contradiction. Predators don't preserve their victims' final wishes. They don't carefully maintain personal effects for eventual discovery. They certainly don't leave maps showing where the bodies could be found, unless the victims weren't running from something, unless they were running toward it. On August 11th, a park ranger named Christine Lee reported finding something while expanding the search perimeter. 1.5 miles north of the trappers' camp, carved into the face of a limestone outcrop, someone had chiseled a message in foot-high letters: "Paradise Hollow." The door opens when called. Below the words, a crude symbol, 3 parallel lines, identical to the marks carved into each skull. Christine Lee photographed the carving, filed her report, and requested immediate reassignment to a different district. In her statement, she wrote, "I felt watched the entire time I stood at that outcrop, not by a person, by the mountain itself. I don't care if that sounds crazy. I'm not going back." 3 other team members reported similar sensations over the following week: a pressure behind the eyes, a sensation of being evaluated, and always, the certainty that something vast and patient was observing their investigation with mild amusement, like a cat watching mice discuss the nature of predation. What would you do if you realized the mountain had never been hunting? What if the mountain had been offering something the victims chose to accept, knowing the cost? Some doors should remain closed, but someone always opens them anyway. In September 2020, investigative journalist Rachel Kwan traveled to Harlan, Kentucky, armed with census records, a tape recorder, and questions that 8 decades of silence had kept buried. She wasn't looking for answers about the trappers. She was looking for the people who'd watched them leave and never asked the right questions when they didn't return. What she found was a community that had spent 3 generations perfecting the art of selective memory. The first interview subject was Margaret Cates, 89 years old, granddaughter of Virgil Cates through his daughter Helen. Margaret had been 7 years old when her grandfather vanished, too young to remember him clearly, but old enough to absorb the fear that settled over her family like ash after a fire. "Granny Mary never talked about it," Margaret told Rachel, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup in her small kitchen. The autumn light slanted through lace curtains. Clock ticked somewhere in the next room. "But I remember how she'd flinch every time someone mentioned the sink. And I remember the men who came to the house about 6 months after Grandpa disappeared. Men from the search party? Rachel asked. No. Margaret's voice dropped. Men from the timber company. 3 of them, wearing suits that didn't fit right for mountain country. They talked to Granny in the front room while Helen and I listened from the stairs. Couldn't make out most of it, but I heard one of them say clear as day, "Some contracts can't be broken, Mrs. Cates. Some debts get paid whether we want them to or not." The timber company, Appalachian Lumber Consolidated, dissolved in 1952. Its records, Rachel discovered, had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1968. Convenient. Too convenient. But corporate documents filed with the Kentucky Secretary of State revealed that Appalachian Lumber Consolidated had contracted trappers in the Sink region 7 times between 1892 and 1940. Each contract followed an identical pattern: small crews, exceptional pay, remote locations, and inevitable disappearances attributed to natural causes. The company had been feeding the mountain for 50 years. Rachel's second interview took her to a nursing home in Middlesbrough, where she found Calvin Pruitt, 94 years old, nephew of Daniel Pruitt, one of the trappers who'd vanished with Virgil Cates. Calvin's memory flickered like a bad bulb, but certain details remained sharp. Uncle Danny came home for Christmas in '39, Calvin recalled, his gnarled hands picking at the blanket across his lap. Was the last time we saw him. He seemed different, excited almost. Kept talking about a job that would change everything. Said he'd been having dreams about the mountains, about voices calling him by name. Did he say what kind of voices? Calvin's eyes went distant. He said they sang in a language older than Cherokee, older than the trees. Said he'd heard them once before, when he was young, and he'd spent 20 years trying to find them again. Said this time he knew where to look. The pattern repeated across 5 more interviews. Family members describing loved ones who'd seemed drawn rather than hired. A great-aunt who mentioned her uncle Marcus Webb spending his final weeks at home reading obscure folklore books borrowed from a traveling scholar. A distant cousin who recalled Amos Finch leaving a note that read simply, "Finally found the door Mary Jane always said existed." These men hadn't been victims of circumstance. They'd been seekers who'd found what they were looking for. But the most damning testimony came from Owen McAllister's grandson, Thomas, 79 years old, still living in the family home where his grandfather had told stories on cold winter nights. Grandpa went back to that camp twice after the official search ended, Thomas revealed, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel had to lean close to catch the words. 1943 and 46. Never told the authorities. Went alone, on horseback, carrying offerings. What kind of offerings? Tobacco, honey, salt, old trade goods? Thomas paused, his jaw working. And information. He'd bring news about men who were asking questions. Men who were getting too curious about the sink. Grandpa said it was protection money. Said as long as he kept the mountain fed with what it wanted, it wouldn't reach out and take what it needed. Rachel felt the room tilt slightly. Your grandfather was an accomplice? My grandfather was terrified. Thomas's hands shook. He told me once, the night before he died, that on his last visit in '46, he saw someone. A figure standing at the tree line near the camp. Couldn't tell if it was man or woman, young or old, but it watched him leave the offerings, and he heard it laugh. Not a cruel laugh, he said, but the laugh of someone who just won a bet they'd been waiting decades to collect on. The implications crawled under Rachel's skin like insects. If Owen McAllister had been protecting the secret, How many others had done the same? How many people in Harlan, in Middlesbrough, in the small communities scattered through the Cumberland Gap, had known that something in the sink was claiming victims and had chosen silence over intervention? She found her answer in the Harlan County Library archives, buried in a box of old newspaper clippings. A letter to the editor, published March 1941, unsigned but typed on what appeared to be official letterhead, with the header carefully torn away. The recent tragedy in our mountain communities serves as reminder that certain places demand respect. Our forefathers understood this. They understood that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond superstition. We would do well to honor their wisdom and cease our questions about matters that are, quite simply, none of our concern. The mountain has always taken its due. Let us not invite further misfortune by disturbing what should remain undisturbed. 23 people had vanished over a century, and an entire community had convinced itself that ignorance was survival. What would you do if your neighbor disappeared and you suspected why? But speaking up meant becoming the next name on an invisible list. What would you do if the price of your safety was someone else's silence? Some voices should never be preserved, but technology doesn't discriminate. On October 9, 2020, digital forensics specialist Amanda Price arrived at the FBI's Quantico laboratory, carrying a storage box that had sat in an evidence locker for 80 years. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating paper, lay a wire recorder, a mid-1930s recording device that used thin steel wire instead of tape to capture audio. The machine had been found in the trapper's main cabin, tucked beneath a bunk frame, its wire spool still intact. Nobody had thought to check if it still contained a recording. Amanda spent 3 days carefully transferring the wire to a modern reel, using archival techniques to prevent the brittle metal from snapping. The audio quality, when it finally played through laboratory speakers, was poor. Hissing static punctuated by voices that seemed to drift in and out of range like distant radio signals. But the words were clear enough. The recording began with ambient sounds. Wind through trees, the crackle of a fire, the clink of metal tools. Then a voice, identified by voice pattern analysis as belonging to Virgil Cates, speaking in a measured tone that suggested he was recording a formal log entry. January 28, 1940. This is Virgil Cates, contract number 473A. We've completed Sector 7 and moved into Sector 8 as planned. Pelt count stands at 42. Weather holding, supply runner departed this morning. Standard field documentation. Nothing unusual. The recording continued for several minutes. Mundane details about trap placement, animal movements, equipment maintenance. Then, approximately 8 minutes in, a second voice interrupted. Eugene Cates, Virgil's younger brother, speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. Virgil, you need to come see this. Right now. Daniel found something near the eastern boundary. You need to see this. The sound of movement, footsteps crunching on frozen ground, heavy breathing. Then silence for nearly 30 seconds, broken only by the whisper of wind and that persistent background hiss. When Virgil spoke again, his voice had changed. The measured confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded like wonder and terror in equal measure. My God, how long has this been here? Another voice. Marcus Webb, confirmed by his family's comparison to old recordings, responding, Amos says forever, says the Cherokee knew about it, but wouldn't speak its name. Virgil, we should leave. Whatever this is, it isn't meant for us. But look at it. Look at the craftsmanship. This wasn't made by any tribe I've heard of. These symbols. A fourth voice, quiet and thoughtful. Amos Finch, They're older than symbols, Virgil. They're invitations, and we just accepted by finding them. The recording dissolved into static for nearly a minute. When sound returned, the ambient noise had changed. The wind sounded wrong, not louder but denser, as if the air itself had thickened. And beneath it, barely audible, something that might have been singing, or might have been the mountain settling, a low droning that made Amanda's teeth ache when she listened through headphones. Daniel Pruitt's voice emerged from the noise. "It's opening. Jesus Christ, it's actually opening. Tell me you're all seeing this." "We're seeing it," Virgil confirmed. "The question is, do we go in?" "The contract didn't mention anything like this." "The contract," Amos said slowly, "was never about wolves. The timber company knew. They've always known. We were hired to find this, not to trap animals." A long pause. The sound of men breathing hard, the way people breathe when standing at the edge of decision that can't be undone. Then Eugene's voice, younger and more reckless than the others. "I'm going in. I didn't come all this way to turn back now." "Eugene, wait!" The recording captured footsteps moving away, then stopping, a gasp, then laughter. Not Eugene's voice this time, but something else. Something that used laughter the way humans use words. It rose and fell in patterns that suggested meaning without ever becoming language. "Marcus, that's not Eugene anymore." "Virgil, Eugene, come back out!" But the voice that responded wasn't quite Eugene's anymore. The pitch was right. The accent was right. But the rhythm of speech had changed, as if something was speaking through a translation device that didn't quite capture human cadence. "Brother, you should see what's in here. You should all see. It's showing me things. It's showing me what we really are." "What does that mean?" "Eugene, what are you?" "We're not the first. We're not even close. There are so many, Virgil. So many who came before, who made the same choice we're making right now. And they're all still here. They never left because they never wanted to. The mountain doesn't take. The mountain offers. And what it offers is worth everything." Static surged, drowning the voices. When it cleared, all 5 men were speaking at once. Excited, overlapping, their words impossible to separate. Amanda isolated individual phrases during her analysis. "Finally makes sense. Mary will understand once Not death, it's transformation. Been waiting for us specifically." The others left their skulls as markers, not warnings. The recording ended with a sound that audio analysis couldn't properly classify. It registered as human screaming, but the frequency patterns suggested multiple voices synthesized into a single sustained note that held for 47 seconds before cutting off abruptly. Then silence. Amanda Price submitted her report on October 14th. She included the full transcript, the audio files, and her professional analysis. She also included a personal note, typed at 3 a.m. after listening to the recording alone in her home office. "I've worked with audio evidence for 16 years. I've heard confessions, death threats, final words from disaster sites. This is the first recording that I believe should be destroyed rather than preserved." Whatever was happening on that wire, the men weren't being killed. They were accepting an invitation to something that wanted them specifically. And I think it got them. I think it got exactly what it wanted. The FBI classified the recording as evidence and sealed it from public release. Only 12 people outside the investigation team have heard it in full. Amanda Price was the 13th. She requested transfer to a different division 3 weeks after completing the transcription and refuses to discuss the case in any capacity. Because once you've heard something invite you by name from 80 years in the past, you start listening for your own voice in the static. And sooner or later, you hear it. The mountain keeps its promises, even when no one asks it to. In December 2020, the FBI officially closed the investigation into the Appalachian trapper disappearances, filing a report that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while answering precisely nothing. The case summary attributed the deaths to undetermined causes in a remote environment, recommended the site be declared a protected archaeological zone, and suggested no further excavation be conducted without explicit federal oversight. Translation: leave it alone. The cabins were dismantled board by board, cataloged, and transported to a climate-controlled facility in Virginia where they would never be displayed. The 17 skulls were returned to identified family members when possible, the remainder interred in a mass grave with a marker that read simply, "Unknown Persons," circa 1840-1940. The cave entrance was sealed with concrete and rebar, then covered with 3 feet of imported soil and planted with fast-growing ground cover. Within 6 months, you wouldn't know anything had ever been there. But Sarah Chen and Marcus Holloway knew. They'd seen the place before the sanitization, before the official narrative smoothed away the sharp edges. And on January 8th, 2021, exactly 81 years after Virgil Cates departed Harlan for the last time, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a leather journal. Not Virgil's journal, which remained in FBI custody. A different one, older, the pages brittle and water-stained. The first entry was dated September 12, 1846, written in careful script by someone with education and steady hands. My name is Silas Hardwick. If you are reading this, then the mountain has decided you should know what waits in Paradise Hollow. I came seeking fortune. I found something far more valuable and far more terrible. I found the door that opens when called, and I learned what stands on the other side. We are not the first intelligent species to walk this continent. We are merely the most recent. Before us, something else built cities in these mountains, cities that sank into the earth when their purpose was fulfilled. The door in Paradise Hollow is all that remains, a threshold between what we are and what we might become. The price is simple: mortality for knowledge, flesh for understanding, self for truth. I paid willingly. So did the others whose bones you will find if you follow this map. We are not victims. We are pioneers who chose to step through a door that most people spend lifetimes pretending doesn't exist. The skulls we leave are not trophies but invitations, marked with the symbol that grants passage. 3 lines representing past, present, and future, all accessible to those brave enough to abandon the tyranny of linear time. If you feel called, come. The mountain remembers everyone who approaches, and it offers each person exactly what they need to make the choice. For some, that means visions. For others, voices. For me, it was dreams of my father, dead these 10 years, showing me wonders I cannot describe in language designed for 3 dimensions. The timber companies know. They've always known. Every generation, they hire seekers under the pretense of mundane work, guiding those with potential toward the threshold. It's a mercy, really. Better to choose transformation than to waste decades in confusion, sensing there's something more but never finding it. Come if you dare. The door opens when called. It has already begun calling you, or you wouldn't be reading this. Sarah showed the journal to Marcus over coffee at a diner 300 miles from the site. They read it together in silence, their hands shaking, their coffee growing cold. It's a lie. Marcus said finally. It has to be. A hoax, or psychological manipulation, or... Then why did they send it to us specifically? Sarah interrupted. Why not the FBI? Why not a journalist? Why the two people who found the camp? Marcus had no answer. That night, Sarah dreamed of her grandmother, dead since 2008, standing at the edge of a forest clearing. In the dream, her grandmother smiled and said, "You've been looking for this place your whole life, sweetheart. Everyone in our bloodline eventually finds it. We're descended from seekers, and the mountain remembers bloodlines." Sarah woke at 4 a.m., her heart racing, and found Marcus sitting in his hotel room chair, staring at his laptop screen. He'd been researching his family genealogy. His great-great-grandfather, a man named Jonathan Holloway, had disappeared in the Cumberland Gap region in 1878 while working as a surveyor. They didn't speak about it. What was there to say? By March 2021, both had quit their jobs. By April, they'd liquidated their savings. By May, they were hiking back into the mountains, carrying supplies and a GPS unit programmed with coordinates that hadn't been in the journal, but that Sarah had somehow known anyway. The numbers arriving in her mind fully formed while she showered one morning. A park ranger spotted their vehicle abandoned at a trailhead on May 19th. Search teams combed the area for 11 days. They found Sarah's backpack on May 23rd, carefully placed on a fallen log as if she'd meant for it to be discovered. Inside was her phone, her wallet, and a handwritten note. "We're not lost. We're found. Don't look for us. We don't want to be saved from this." The search was called off on June 2nd. 2 years later, in summer 2023, hikers reported finding a new carving on the limestone outcrop where Christine Lee had photographed the Paradise Hollow message. Below the original text, someone had added fresh lettering. 19 now. The count continues. The door remains open. Federal authorities investigated, found no evidence of recent activity, and attributed the carving to vandals capitalizing on media coverage of the Trapper case. But 3 months after that report, Dr. Elizabeth Nakamura submitted her resignation from the FBI. Her final email to colleagues contained no explanation, just a single line. "Some questions shouldn't be answered, but I need to know." She was last seen boarding a bus to Kentucky on November 4th, 2023. Her apartment in Virginia was found undisturbed, her affairs in order, her laptop wiped clean except for a single folder containing Silas Hardwick's journal, photographed page by page in high resolution. The file name read, "Instructions for those who hear the call." What would you do if you discovered that every choice you'd ever made had been guiding you toward a single threshold, and all that remained was deciding whether to step through? We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.